The story of Adam and Eve, as most of us know it, ends at a closed gate. It is a story that concludes in a moment of profound and tragic silence. We see the two figures, clothed in skins of sacrifice, turning their backs on the only home they have ever known. We see the flash of a flaming sword, a permanent and terrifying sentinel barring the way back to paradise. And then, nothing. The curtain falls. The narrative of Genesis moves on, leaving the first man and the first woman standing on the precipice of a new, cursed world, their future shrouded in an almost complete and deafening silence. But what if that was not the end? What if that was only the end of the prologue, the closing of the first act in a much longer, much darker, and much more violent drama? The canonical Bible is hauntingly quiet about what happened next, about their first nights in the terrifying darkness, about their immediate and relentless confrontations with the enemy they had just unwittingly empowered. But in the ancient chronicles that Ethiopia preserved, the story is not silent. It roars, and the story it tells is not one of quiet, sorrowful exile. It is the chronicle of a war. A guerrilla war fought by a deposed king and queen deep in enemy-occupied territory for the very survival of their souls and for the future of the human race. To uncover the history of this lost war, we must once again turn to the library of the forbidden, to the archives that were preserved in the high, inaccessible mountains of Ethiopia, while the institutional churches of the West chose to forget. It is here that we find a text of breathtaking intimacy and profound spiritual significance, a book whose very title is a declaration of what was lost. It is most commonly known in the West as The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, a title that, while accurate, is somewhat clinical. The Ethiopian tradition often knows it by more poetic names, names that capture its true, sorrowful essence. This is the uncensored chronicle of the first exile. For centuries, this text was dismissed by Western scholarship with a wave of the hand. It was labeled as a late fictional romance, a piece of imaginative Christian fan fiction created by medieval monks to satisfy the pious curiosity of believers about what happened after Genesis chapter 3. But this dismissive diagnosis is an act of profound intellectual arrogance, an assumption that anything not preserved in the libraries of Europe must be of a later and lesser quality. A closer and more honest examination reveals a very different story. While the manuscripts we have today were likely compiled and standardized in the early Christian centuries, they bear the unmistakable fingerprints of a much older oral tradition, a story that was passed down from the earliest days of Semitic and Hebraic thought. It is a text that does not contradict Genesis in any significant way. On the contrary, it is a book that is obsessed with Genesis. It picks up the story at the very moment the gates of Eden are shut, and it seeks to fill the profound and troubling silence that the canonical text leaves in its wake. It answers the questions that Genesis forces us to ask. How did Adam and Eve survive? How did they learn to pray in a fallen world? What was the nature of their ongoing conflict with the enemy who had deceived them? The book of Adam and Eve is not a replacement for Genesis. It is a continuation. It is a plausible and theologically rich account of the war that began after the fall. And for the ancient Ethiopian church, it was never a curiosity. It was and is a vital part of their sacred tradition, a text that provided the crucial missing chapter between the tragedy of Eden's gate and the birth of Adam and Eve's children. Today, we will treat it with the same reverence. we will open its pages and listen to the story of the war after Eden. The story begins with a journey of profound and terrifying dislocation. Adam and Eve, cast out from the garden, stumble through a world that is now alien to them. The text describes the earth beneath their feet as dry, cracked, and sharp with stones. The gentle, ever-present light of Eden, the very Shekinah glory of God that had been their constant companion, is gone. It is replaced by a thinner, harsher sunlight that casts long, menacing shadows. They are no longer clothed in light, but in the rough garments of animal skin that God had made for them, a constant physical reminder of the innocence that had been lost and the blood that had been shed. The book tells us that after a long and sorrowful journey, they arrive at the mouth of a cave. This was not a home they had built, but a dark, pre-existing hollow in the earth. And yet this would be their first dwelling, their first sanctuary, their first fortress in a now hostile world. The Ethiopian tradition gives this place a name of profound and prophetic significance. It is called the Cave of Treasures. The name at first seems cruelly ironic. There were no jewels in this cave, no gold, no earthly riches. The treasures it was destined to hold were of a different and far more precious kind. According to the tradition, this cave was to become the repository for the sacred items that God allowed Adam to take from the vicinity of the garden: gold, myrrh, and frankincense, the very symbols of the redemptive promise. It was also to be the treasury of their memory, the one place on a fallen earth where the story of what was lost and the promise of what was to come would be guarded. This was not just a shelter from the elements. This was the first capital city of a kingdom in exile. Here, Adam, the deposed but not yet defeated king, would establish the first government in exile. It was from this rough-hewn command center that he would begin the long, agonizing, and heroic work of preserving the covenant and fighting a guerrilla war against the new, illegitimate ruler of the world. Adam and Eve had never known true darkness before. In the Garden of Eden, the very presence of God had been their constant source of light. But as the sun set on their first day in exile, they were plunged into a terrifying, absolute blackness that was both physical and spiritual. It was in this moment of their deepest weakness, their most profound vulnerability, that the enemy chose to strike. The Book of Adam and Eve describes a scene of raw psychological warfare. Satan, who had been watching them from the shadows, did not appear to them in a physical form. He did not come with temptations of power or pleasure. He came with a single, devastatingly effective weapon: the sound of despair. The text says that in the depths of the night, Adam and Eve heard a sound that was neither the wind nor the cry of any beast they had ever known. It began as a low, guttural wail that seemed to rise from the very stones of the earth, a sound of ancient and inconsolable grief. Then the wail rose into a piercing, supernatural howl, a cry so filled with malice and hatred that it felt, the text says, as if the very walls of the cave would split apart. This was not the roar of a physical predator. This was the voice of the accuser himself, a sonic assault designed to shatter their last remnants of hope. And then, woven into the howl, came the words. They were not shouted. They were whispered directly into their minds, a torrent of mocking, twisting accusations, each one aimed like a poisoned arrow at the heart of their faith. "Look at you now," the voice taunted. "From glory to dust, from the throne of the garden to this pit of despair. The one who made you has abandoned you. The promises are broken. The garden is lost forever. There is no hope." This was not a temptation to sin. This was a temptation to despair. It was the first strategic act of the new, illegitimate ruler of the world. And his goal was simple: to convince the deposed king and queen to surrender, to accept their defeat, to believe that God's silence was proof of his absence. It was a war for their will to live, for their will to fight. And in that dark cave, in that moment of absolute terror, Adam and Eve were forced to discover a new kind of weapon. It was not a weapon of strength, but of weakness. Through their tears, they began to pray. The enemy's first assault, a brutal campaign of psychological terror, had failed. Adam and Eve's desperate prayer, a raw cry of faith from the depths of their despair, had proven to be a weapon that the darkness could not overcome. And so, in this ongoing war for the souls of our first parents, the adversary changed his strategy. In warfare, if a frontal assault fails, the next move is often one of deception and infiltration. If you cannot break your enemy with fear, you must try to seduce them with a false hope. The book of Adam and Eve tells us that Satan, having been repelled by their prayers, returned not with a scream, but with a disguise so beautiful, so alluring, that it could almost pass for a divine blessing. One day, as Adam was foraging for food in the barren wilderness, he saw a figure in the distance. It was a woman of breathtaking, almost unearthly beauty. Her skin shone like polished onyx, her hair flowed in the desert wind, and her eyes held an intoxicating mixture of wisdom and desire. She did not approach him with threats, but with words of comfort and sympathy. She spoke of his suffering, of the injustice of his exile, of the harshness of a God who would cast his own children out into such a desolate world. She offered him an easy way out. She promised him relief from his toil, food without labor, comfort without struggle. And then her words grew bolder. She began to offer him a counterfeit kingdom. "I can give you more than what you lost," the illusion whispered. "Power over this land, authority over all its creatures, a life free from the constraints of a jealous and demanding God." This was not just a temptation of the flesh, it was a sophisticated political offer. It was a temptation to form a new alliance, to trade his loyalty to the distant, silent God of heaven for the immediate, tangible rewards of the new God of this world. It was the same lie that had been told in the garden, but repackaged. Not "you will be like God," but "you can have a kingdom without God." It was a masterstroke of deception, an appeal to Adam's weariness, to his grief, and to the lingering memory of the royal authority he had once possessed. And for a moment, the text tells us, Adam faltered. But then, a deeper memory stirred within him, the memory of the original command, the memory of a true and loving king whose presence, even in its absence, was more real than the beautiful lie that now stood before him. He rejected the offer, and in that moment of loyal refusal, the illusion shattered, and the true, hideous form of the enemy was once again exposed. Adam had not just survived another battle. He had learned a critical piece of strategic intelligence. The enemy's most dangerous weapon was not his roar, but his disguise. Having survived the enemy's assaults of both despair and deception, Adam and Eve now faced a new and more intimate phase of their war, the challenge of building a family, of establishing a legacy in a fallen and hostile world. The book of Adam and Eve reveals that their union as husband and wife, a union that had been blessed in the perfection of Eden, now had to be reconsecrated, fortified, and transformed into a strategic act of covenantal preservation. This was no longer just about companionship. It was about the survival of the royal line. The text describes a remarkable and profoundly disciplined period of preparation. Knowing that the enemy would seek to corrupt the very act that would bring forth the promised seed of the woman, Adam and Eve entered into a season of separation, of prayer, and of fasting. For, the book tells us, a period of 223 days they lived as brother and sister, not as husband and wife. This was not a rejection of physical intimacy, but a sanctification of it. It was a conscious and deliberate act of placing their union under the direct authority and timing of God, a declaration that their family would be built not on the foundation of human desire, but on the bedrock of divine appointment. When the appointed time finally came, the text describes a sacred and prophetic ceremony. God himself, the text says, brought them 3 gifts from the vicinity of the garden: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These were not random treasures. They were prophetic symbols, a divine dowry that foretold the entire story of redemption. The gold was the symbol of the kingship of the coming Messiah. The frankincense, the incense of the temple, was the symbol of his priesthood and his role as our intercessor. And the myrrh, the bitter herb used for anointing and for burial, was the symbol of his suffering and his sacrificial death. Centuries later, a group of wise men from the East, guided by a star, would bring these exact same 3 gifts to a newborn king in a manger in Bethlehem, sealing the prophetic link between the first marriage covenant outside of Eden and the ultimate new covenant of salvation. The union of Adam and Eve was not just about the creation of a family. It was a strategic act in the war for redemption, a fortification of the very bloodline through which the promised victor would one day enter the world. The mountain of Seth was intended to be a fortress, a high-altitude sanctuary designed to protect the righteous seed from the spiritual contamination of the world below. For a time, the strategy worked. The descendants of Seth, the sons of God, maintained their separation, preserving the ancient ways of worship and the memory of the Edenic covenant. But a fortress, no matter how high its walls, is only as strong as the vigilance of its defenders. And the enemy, having failed in his direct assaults on Adam, now adopted a new and far more patient strategy: infiltration. The ancient chronicles describe a slow and subtle process of cultural erosion. From their holy mountain, the sons of Seth could hear the sounds drifting up from the cities of Cain in the plains below. They heard the sounds of a vibrant, technologically advanced, and artistically seductive culture. They heard the music of the lyre and the pipe, instruments that their own austere traditions did not possess. They saw the glitter of the bronze and iron tools and ornaments that the Cainites had forged. Curiosity began to gnaw at the edges of their consecration. The texts describe how the young men of Seth's line, the guardians of the covenant, began to descend from the mountain, telling themselves they would only look, only listen. But they were walking from a place of spiritual discipline into a world that was designed for seduction. In the valleys they encountered the daughters of men, the women of the Cainite line. The texts describe them as being beautiful, adorned with the cosmetics and jewelry that the fallen angelic arts had taught them. Their culture was one of celebration, of festivals, of a freedom from the strict and sober piety of the mountain. And the sons of Seth were captivated. They did not just visit, they stayed. They took wives from among the daughters of Cain, shattering the principle of separation that had protected their lineage for generations. This was not just a series of unfortunate marriages, it was a catastrophic spiritual and genetic merger. It was a successful intelligence operation by the enemy, an infiltration that did not require a single sword to be drawn. The fortress did not fall because its walls were breached from the outside. It fell because its own citizens willingly opened the gates from within. And in doing so, they unleashed a tide of corruption that would lead directly to the genetic apocalypse of the Nephilim and the judgment of the Great Flood. The catastrophic merger of the holy line of Seth with the profane line of Cain did more than just dilute a culture of worship. It created a spiritual vacuum, a moral freefall that set the stage for the next and most devastating phase of the enemy's war against the human race. The government in exile, which had been established on the mountain of holiness, had effectively collapsed. The guardians of the covenant had abandoned their post. And in the wake of this spiritual implosion, a new and far more terrifying power rushed in to fill the void. This is the critical, missing context for the story of the Watchers and the Nephilim. The angelic mutiny and the subsequent invasion of the earth did not happen in a vacuum. It happened at a time when humanity, through the failure of the Sethite line, had already lowered its own spiritual defenses. They had chosen to integrate with a culture that was already in rebellion against God, and in doing so, they had made themselves vulnerable to a deeper and more profound form of corruption. The Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees place this angelic incursion at precisely this moment in history. As the sons of Seth were descending the mountain to take the daughters of Cain as their wives, the fallen Watchers were descending from the heavens to do the very same thing. The sin on the earthly plane was mirrored by a sin on the celestial one. This resulted in a dual corruption. The human-to-human unions produced a generation that was spiritually compromised. But the angel-to-human unions produced the Nephilim, a generation that was genetically monstrous. The spiritual failure of the sons of Seth did not, in itself, cause the Great Flood, but it created the perfect, chaotic, and lawless conditions for the crime that did. It was the preliminary battle that weakened the defenses and allowed the main invading force to land on the beaches. The failed kingdom in exile of Seth was not the end of the story, but it was the tragic prelude to a horror so profound that it would require a global, divine reset. We have now seen the full, tragic, and epic scope of the war after Eden as it is preserved in the uncensored chronicles. It is not just a story of Adam and Eve's personal suffering. It is a story of a deposed king and queen fighting a guerrilla war from a cave, of the founding of two rival kingdoms, and of the ultimate failure of the righteous line through a catastrophic act of spiritual infiltration. And this brings us to the central question of our investigation. Why was this entire, strategically vital history, a history that provides the essential context for the Great Flood, so thoroughly suppressed? The primary motive of the later gatekeepers, the scribes and theologians who shaped our canonical Bible, was the need to control the image of Adam himself. The Adam of the uncensored chronicles, the Adam of the Book of Adam and Eve, is not a simple, passive and repentant sinner. He is a king. Even in his exile, even in his defeat, he is portrayed as a leader, a fighter, a strategist, a man who is actively engaged in a perpetual war against the forces of darkness. He is a warrior king, and this is a dangerous image for any centralized religious institution to promote. A simple, repentant sinner is a figure who is in desperate need of the institution's forgiveness, of its rituals, of its priestly mediation. A repentant sinner is a manageable subject. But a warrior king is a different figure entirely. A warrior king does not just inspire repentance, he inspires resistance. He does not just create followers, he raises an army. The gatekeepers of the new institutional Christianity did not want a congregation of spiritual warriors. They wanted a flock of compliant sheep. And so, the image of Adam had to be changed. The story of his long, grinding, post-Edenic war had to be erased. He had to be transformed from a deposed but still fighting king into a simple, tragic figure whose story effectively ends at the gate of the garden. By erasing the king, they could erase the very model of a faith that is active, resistant, and perpetually at war. The erasure of Adam the warrior king was part of a larger, more systematic campaign to reframe the entire biblical narrative. The gatekeepers of the new orthodoxy took a story that was, in its essence, about a cosmic territorial conflict, and they skillfully reduced it to a story that was primarily about personal moral sin. This was a brilliant and devastatingly effective act of theological reductionism. The uncensored chronicle, as we have seen, is a war story. It is about a deposed king fighting to preserve a covenant line in enemy-occupied territory. It is about the rise of two competing kingdoms, one spiritual and one secular. It is about the strategic infiltration of the enemy to corrupt a holy bloodline. The primary issues are sovereignty, territory, and allegiance. But the redacted narrative that we have been given is a story about morality. The primary issue is no longer a territorial conflict, but an internal psychological struggle. The focus shifts from the grand, external war for a planet to the small, internal war for the individual soul. This shift served a crucial purpose for the institutional church. It is far easier to build a religion around the management of personal morality than it is to build one around the prosecution of a cosmic war. A system of confession, penance, and priestly absolution is a powerful tool for managing a population whose primary problem is personal guilt. But such a system is largely irrelevant in the context of a territorial war that requires strategic intelligence, spiritual discernment, and active militant resistance. By transforming the story from a cosmic war into a personal moral drama, the gatekeepers were able to create a version of the faith that their own institutional structure was perfectly designed to solve. They did not just change the story. They created a problem for which they could sell the only authorized solution. They replaced the battlefield map with a moral handbook. The most damaging and strategically costly consequence of this great act of censorship was not just the erasure of Adam's royal identity, but the concealment of the enemy's long-term strategy. The uncensored chronicle of the war after Eden is a masterclass in the tactics of the adversary. It reveals with chilling clarity that his goal has never been just to tempt individuals into random acts of sin. His goal has always been a strategic, generational, and almost genetic one: to attack, to infiltrate, and to corrupt the holy, covenantal bloodline through which the promised Redeemer was destined to come. Consider the pattern. His assaults on Adam and Eve in the cave were not just random acts of malice. They were attempts to break their will and to prevent them from having children altogether. His seduction of the Sethite line was not just a campaign to promote immorality. It was a strategic move to dilute and contaminate the righteous seed with the rebellious seed of Cain. And the subsequent invasion of the Watchers was the ultimate expression of this strategy. a direct biological assault on the human genome, an attempt to make the birth of a pure human savior a genetic impossibility. This is the central, driving plotline of the primordial war. It is a war for the bloodline. But by erasing the detailed chronicle of the Book of Adam and Eve, and by reducing the story of the Watchers to 4 cryptic verses, the gatekeepers effectively hid this entire strategic context from us. The result is that we often see the subsequent events of the Old Testament as a series of disconnected individual stories. We see the enemy's attempts to destroy Israel, to corrupt the line of David, to kill the infant Jesus in Bethlehem as isolated acts of evil. But the uncensored history reveals that these are not isolated acts. They are all sequential battles in a single millennia-long military campaign, a relentless and strategic war to stop the prophecy of Genesis 3:15 from ever coming to pass. By hiding the first battles, the gatekeepers made it almost impossible for us to understand the full strategic coherence of the entire war. The uncensored story of the war after Eden is not just a forgotten piece of ancient history. It is a mirror. It is a living, breathing paradigm that reveals the true nature of your own spiritual life. The story of Adam is our story, and his war is our war. To awaken to this truth is to realize that you are not just a humble believer seeking a quiet life of personal piety. You are a king in exile. You are a descendant of a royal line, a child of the Most High King, created in his image to exercise dominion and authority in the created world. But you have been born, like Seth and his descendants, into a world that is largely enemy-occupied territory. You are living behind enemy lines. The culture that surrounds you, the systems that govern you, the very air you breathe, is saturated with the values and the philosophies of the rival kingdom of Cain. This understanding changes everything. Your daily struggles are no longer just personal failings or psychological issues. They are the skirmishes of a guerrilla war. The temptation to despair is not just a bad mood. It is a strategic assault on your will to fight, the same assault that Adam faced in the dark of the cave. The allure of a worldly success that demands a compromise of your faith is not just an opportunity. It is a deceptive political offer from the old regime, the same offer of a counterfeit kingdom that was made to Adam in the wilderness. And your mission as a king in exile is the same as Adam's was: to guard the treasure, to protect the sacred covenant within your own heart, to maintain your allegiance to the one true and rightful king even when his kingdom is not yet fully visible, to build a family, a community, a life that is an outpost of the coming kingdom, a fortress of holiness on a mountain that refuses to be infiltrated or assimilated by the seductive culture of the plains below. This is not just a story you are reading, it is the story you are living. In the uncensored chronicle, the Cave of Treasures was the physical and spiritual center of Adam and Eve's kingdom in exile. It was more than just a shelter. It was their first fortress, their first sanctuary, their first war room. It was the one place on a fallen earth where they could guard the memories of Eden and the promises of a future redemption. And this ancient physical place serves as a powerful and enduring metaphor for the spiritual reality of every believer. The Cave of Treasures is your heart. It is the sacred interior space where you, like Adam, must guard the treasure of your own covenant with God. The world outside is a wilderness, filled with the howls of despair and the beautiful, shimmering illusions of the enemy. The culture is constantly trying to invade your thoughts, to plant seeds of doubt, to offer you counterfeit comforts and counterfeit kingdoms. And so, your heart must become a fortress. It must be a place of vigilant prayer, a command center where you receive your daily intelligence and your marching orders from the great King. It must be a treasury where you store and protect the sacred promises of His word, the gold of His kingship, the frankincense of His priestly intercession, and the myrrh of His sacrificial love. This is the central lesson of the war after Eden. The first and most important territory that must be defended is not a nation or a building, but the 1-foot square piece of real estate that is your own heart. For if the enemy can conquer that cave, if he can extinguish the light of the promise that you guard within, then all the external battles are already lost. But if you, like Adam, can learn to guard that sacred space, to make it a place of unceasing prayer and unwavering allegiance, then you become an unconquerable outpost of the kingdom of God, a cave of treasures that the darkness can never, ever overcome. The story of the war after Eden is a story of immense and often heartbreaking struggle. It is a story of a deposed king, of a failed government in exile on the mountain of Seth, and of a world that seemed to be spiraling inevitably toward a total victory for the forces of darkness. But woven through this entire tragic chronicle is a single golden thread of unwavering and defiant hope. It is the thread of the unbroken royal line. From the very beginning, in the moment of the first curse in the garden, God had made a promise. He had declared that from the seed of the woman would come a champion, a promised son, who would one day rise up and crush the head of the serpent. This was the ultimate strategic objective of the entire cosmic war. For the kingdom of darkness, the mission was to corrupt or destroy this promised bloodline. For the kingdom of heaven, the mission was to protect it at all costs. And so, even when Adam failed, the promise was passed to Seth. Even when the line of Seth fell into apostasy and mingled with the line of Cain, God preserved a remnant, a single righteous family in the person of Noah, to carry that sacred seed through the waters of judgment. And from Noah, the promise was passed to Abraham, and from Abraham to David, and from David, through centuries of war, exile, and silence, that royal line was miraculously and stubbornly preserved. This is the ultimate context for the coming of Jesus Christ. He was not just a spiritual teacher who appeared at a random moment in history. He was the long-awaited, prophesied, and final heir of this ancient, unbroken royal line. He was the promised son, the king returning from a long exile to lead the final decisive battle for his father's kingdom. He was the fulfillment of the promise that had been guarded in the cave of treasures, the one to whom the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh truly belonged. The story of Adam and Eve's war is not, in the end, a story of their failure. It is the story of the incredible, millennia-long, and ultimately successful campaign that God waged to ensure that their promised champion would one day arrive on the battlefield. To embrace this uncensored history of the war after Eden is to be awakened to a profound and deeply uncomfortable truth. The spiritual battle is not a metaphor. It is not a psychological struggle between our better and worse selves. It is a real, historical, and ongoing territorial conflict between two rival kingdoms, a conflict that is being waged for the future of this planet. The story of the divergence between the line of Cain and the line of Seth is the story of the founding of these two kingdoms on earth. The kingdom of Cain is the kingdom of this world. It is the civilization of man built on human strength, on technological progress, on commercial enterprise, and ultimately on a foundation of rebellion against God. It is the kingdom of the city, of the flatlands, a kingdom that seeks to build its own paradise here on earth, without reference to the king in heaven. The kingdom of Seth was meant to be the embassy of heaven on earth. It was the kingdom of the mountain, of the altar, of separation and consecration. Its purpose was not to build a worldly empire, but to preserve a spiritual memory and to guard a sacred promise. And the story of their eventual tragic merger is the story that has defined human history ever since. It is a story of constant compromise, of the people of God being seduced by the music, the beauty, and the power of the rival kingdom. And this war is real. Every choice you make every day is an act of construction. You are either using your time, your resources, and your talents to build a small piece of the kingdom of Cain, a kingdom that is destined to fall, or you are using them to build a small outpost of the kingdom of Seth, the kingdom in exile that is awaiting the return of its true king. There is no neutral ground. Every act is an act of allegiance. Every life is a brick in the wall of one of these two cities. The war is real. The uncensored chronicle of Adam and Eve's life after the fall is a story of immense sorrow, of constant struggle, and of terrifying spiritual warfare. But it is not, in the end, a story of despair. Woven through the entire narrative is a profound and beautiful counter-theme, the story of a God who does not abandon his people, even in their exile. The popular simplified version of the fall can often leave us with the impression of an angry God who, after the sin, slammed the gates of Eden shut and turned his back on humanity, leaving them to their own devices in a cursed world. But the book of Adam and Eve paints a very different picture. It is a story that is saturated with divine intervention and angelic comfort. When Adam and Eve are overwhelmed by despair in the darkness of the cave, it is the word of God, carried by an angel, that comes to comfort them and to remind them of the promise of redemption. When they are hungry, it is God who shows them where to find edible food in the barren wilderness. When they are learning to live in a fallen world, it is angels who are dispatched to teach them how to build shelters, how to make fire, and how to offer prayers of repentance. This is a truth of profound and radical grace. It reveals a God who is not a distant and disappointed landlord, but a loving and patient father. He did not abandon his children after their rebellion. He followed them into their exile. He continued to teach them, to provide for them, and to protect them, even as they lived with the consequences of their own choices. This is the ultimate hope that this forbidden book restores to us. It proves that the gates of Eden may have been shut, but the gates of heaven never were. The line of communication was never completely severed. Even in the deepest darkness of our own exile, even in the midst of our own most desperate struggles, we are not alone. The same God who sent his angels to comfort Adam and Eve in their cave is the same God who sends his Spirit to comfort us in ours. His presence is the one treasure that the enemy can never, ever steal from us. And so we must now ask a final critical question. If this story is so ancient, so foundational, and so theologically rich, why was it preserved with such care in the highlands of Ethiopia, while being almost completely forgotten by the powerful institutional churches of the West? The answer lies in the very nature of Ethiopia's unique historical and prophetic role. As we have seen in our previous investigations, Ethiopia has always stood apart. Geographically isolated by mountains and deserts, and theologically independent from the imperial authority of Rome, it became a unique sanctuary, a safe deposit box for the ancient traditions that were being systematically suppressed elsewhere. While the Western Church was busy editing its canon, Hellenizing its theology, and aligning itself with the political power of Caesar, Ethiopia was quietly and stubbornly preserving the older, wilder, and more profoundly Hebraic version of the faith. It is no accident that Ethiopia is the nation that preserved the full, uncensored chronicles of Enoch and Jubilees. And it is no accident that it is also the nation that preserved the story of the war after Eden. Ethiopia became, in a very real sense, a second ark. Noah's Ark preserved the genetic seed of humanity through the waters of a physical flood, and the nation of Ethiopia, in its mountain fastnesses, preserved the historical and theological memory of humanity through the long, dark flood of imperial censorship and historical amnesia. They did not just preserve a book, they preserved a context. They remembered that the story of our faith is not a simple moral fable. It is a cosmic war story. They remembered that our first parents were not just sinners, they were soldiers. And they remembered that our enemy is not a vague concept, but a real, strategic, and relentless adversary. While the West forgot the war, Ethiopia remembered the battle plan. And in our own time, as the final chapters of this ancient conflict begin to unfold, the treasures that were hidden in that ark of memory are finally being brought back into the light. And so, we have completed our investigation into the war after Eden. We began with the haunting silence that follows the closing of the garden gate in Genesis chapter 3. We journeyed into the uncensored chronicle that was preserved in the Ark of Ethiopia, and in its pages we found the missing chapter of our origin story. We have witnessed the first desperate battles of a deposed king and queen fighting a guerrilla war from a cave of treasures. We have seen their strategic fortification of the royal line through a covenant of marriage. We have charted the rise of two rival kingdoms, the secular, technological cities of Cain and the sacred, spiritual government-in-exile on the mountain of Seth. And we have watched with tragic clarity as that holy kingdom fell, not to an external assault, but to an internal infiltration, an act of spiritual seduction that opened the door to the final genetic apocalypse of the Nephilim. We have unmasked the motives of the gatekeepers who chose to suppress this history, their desire to transform Adam from a warrior king into a simple, repentant sinner, and to reduce a cosmic, territorial war into a manageable, personal, moral problem. The complete picture of the fall is now before us. It was not a single, isolated event. It was the first campaign in a long and brutal war, a war for the bloodline, a war for the planet, a war that is still being waged in the headlines of our news and in the secret chambers of our own hearts. The story you were told was of a simple sin in a peaceful garden. The story that was hidden from you is of a desperate war in a fallen world. The book of Genesis, in its redacted form, gives us the declaration of war in chapter 3. But the uncensored chronicle, the book of Adam and Eve, provides us with the first, harrowing dispatches from the front lines. By concealing this chronicle, the gatekeepers of tradition did more than just hide a story. They hid the war itself. They transformed us from soldiers, born into a conflict, into civilians, unaware of the battle that rages all around us. The story of Adam and Eve's struggle is not just the story of their origin. It is a timeless template for our own. Their battles are our battles. The enemy's strategies have not changed. He still seeks to conquer us with despair. He still comes to us disguised as a beautiful, counterfeit blessing, and his ultimate goal is still the same: to infiltrate and corrupt the holy seed, to make us forget the kingdom we belong to, and to seduce us into becoming citizens of his own. To know this story is to be reawakened to the reality of the war. It is to understand that you are not just a sinner in need of forgiveness. You are a king in exile, fighting to guard a sacred promise in enemy territory. And so the final question is this: now that you know that Adam and Eve were engaged in a constant strategic spiritual war from the very moment they left the garden, how does this change the way you see the temptations and the struggles in your own life? Let us know in the comments below.